This is The Reason Interview, where we go deep with the artists, entrepreneurs, politicians, and visionaries who are making the 21st century more libertarian, or at least more interesting, by challenging worn-out ideas and orthodoxies. I'm Billy Binion, guest hosting for Nick Gillespie. Our guest this week is Younes, a civil liberties attorney who was thrust into the national spotlight when she sued the Biden administration for pressuring social media companies to censor content it didn't like. That case, Murthy versus Missouri, ultimately reached the Supreme Court. But Younes is maybe not what you'd expect. She's a former New York City public defender and is now the national legal director at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, where she is planning to sue the Trump administration. Younes and I discussed her unorthodox path to civil liberties advocacy, the threats to free speech from both the left and the right, and why a respect for the First Amendment should be an everyone issue, no matter how much you might hate what's being said. And now, to the Reason interview. Younes, thank you for talking to Reason.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan.
Okay, so you've been a public defender. You sued the Biden administration. You worked for a MAGA congressman. And now you are gearing up to sue the Trump administration. So I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know what to make of all that. So I just want to start off by asking you what guides you in your work.
Just a commitment to defending American civil liberties, especially free speech. That's sort of the main area I've gotten into in my primary area of expertise. But I've also done civil liberties cases more broadly. So I don't really care who is the person violating the rights. I don't bring cases or talk about these issues for political purposes. I do it purely because I care about Americans' rights being upheld.
Why do you think that is a dying art?
I think the country is becoming increasingly partisan, and people have a lot of difficulty seeing through any kind of lens other than their commitment to their political party. They've sort of demonized the other side. Republicans are bad, Democrats are good, or vice versa. And they have a lot of difficulty seeing when their side does something wrong. Or they're willing to overlook it because they think the other side is so evil that their commitment to their party is more important than their commitment to the Constitution or to defending their fellow American civil liberties, even if they don't agree with the person's politics.
Where do you come from politically? I'm curious.
That's a good question, and I ask myself all the time. I had I'll try to keep the answer short. I was sort of traditionally, I would say, a leftist. I loved Bernie Sanders back in 2016. I think that economic injustice is a huge problem in this country. I'm not sure what I think the solution is. I also tend to believe that the federal government is a big problem. There's so many issues with the federal government. So in sort of practical terms, I want to see much less done on the federal level, more done at the state level. I don't have a problem with, Massachusetts having a lot of social services. Texas can have no income tax and no social services, whatever. So I would say maybe I'm kind of a federalist. I do believe that in a decent society, we should help care for the less fortunate. Unfortunately, our tax money doesn't really go towards that. It mostly goes towards wars and political infighting and stuff like that. So I think I end up advocating for sort of federalist policies or libertarian, leaner government, even though I think it could be done if we had a less corrupt political system in a way that actually went towards helping the less fortunate.
It's an interesting journey. And it has led you to become one of the more visible First Amendment lawyers in the country at this point. So I'm interested to hear you describe the health of free speech in America.
It's very sick. It's really, really bad, I would say, and it just keeps getting worse. So I initially got very involved in free speech issues under the Biden administration. I actually traced my interest in free speech back much further in law school, and actually it was one of my breaks with the left was their lack of commitment to free speech. I had several run-ins with people at work when I was in the public defender's office or friends where they were really advocating for sort of hate speech type laws,
right.
Then sort of diminishing protections on free speech, and I was on the other side of that. And they got very angry. People get very angry about these things. But I started my first free speech lawsuit was against the Biden administration. And I also had one against Newsom that was around the same time and actually did well, but it was just at the state level, so it didn't get as much attention. But I sort of thought that Americans would learn from that. Once everything came out about what the administration had done, there was actually new information today from Google. So the sort of, for people who aren't familiar with the underlying issue, the crux of it is that the Biden administration, through various agencies, was exerting pressure, also sort of working with, so not always just pressuring and coercing, but sometimes cooperating with social media companies in order to censor topics and viewpoints that it disfavored, mostly about COVID, but also the 2020 election, the Hunter Biden laptop, a few other subjects were also subject to censorship. So our allegation was that the government cannot use private industry to do what it can't directly. So this is effectively a First Amendment violation. And the case law is very clear in other areas, like the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits the government from searching your home without a warrant. Now, the government also can't like call up your landlord and be like, hey, can you go search Billy's house without a warrant? Because technically you can go in there, but we can't. What would be the point of the Constitution, right? If the government could just outsource what it wanted to do to private companies. So we're sort of arguing that this should be analogized in the First Amendment context. I think we were right. And a lot of what came out was pretty shocking, I think, about the government's coercion of social media companies that effectively resulted in the censorship of a lot of viewpoints, including my clients, who now one of whom is now the head of the NIH, and one is Jay Bhattacharya, and Martin Kulldorff, who is has a prominent position on the CDC vaccine advisory panel. I forgot what his title is, but these are voices we should have been hearing from during COVID, and I thought that people would see this. Unfortunately, what's happened now is that the Trump administration has come in and done a lot of things that are even worse. And ironically, a lot of the people who were very, very critical of Biden and claimed to care about free speech then are now kind of excusing it or justifying it or coming up with these sort of reasons why what Trump is doing is okay.
Do any of those people include your former clients? Justifying it?
My former clients, I wouldn't say have explicitly justified it. I can speak personally. They are very committed to free speech. I think sometimes people who work in government are not necessarily actually in charge, even when it seems that they should be. I'll just speak in sort of general terms. So I'm sure there's stuff going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. I would say RFK was not my client, but I did work with him. His case was consolidated with ours, actually. He's now the HHS secretary. And he's just been totally hypocritical on this issue. Huge disappointment. I worked with Harmeet Dillon, who's the
Civil Rights
DOJ, and is now, taking a very heavy hand and trying to silence a lot of speech that she doesn't like.
Right, especially on university campuses, defending a lot of these professor suspensions. I'm curious. I want to get to the news of the day, but a leftist who ends up, litigating, on behalf of RFK and Jay Bhattacharya or whatever. I write a lot about criminal justice issues, and it is my experience that the public defender universe wasn't necessarily on the forefront of like opposing COVID restrictions and that sort of thing. So I'm just interested to hear what that experience was like among your colleagues and friends. You were in New York City at the time?
Yeah. So I was a public defender in New York for about 9 years, and I lived there for law school. So I was there for a total of 13. It was an odd experience. I was the only person I knew who was against COVID restrictions. To me, it was just obvious. I was just like, you can't just shut down society and totally, have total upheaval in terms of how we live our lives, closing down basically everything except major chains. Well, whether that made sense or not, obviously it didn't. And it was clear to me also it would have effects on developing countries. We don't live in a bubble. No pun intended. We affect other countries with our actions. And it just was very obvious to me that this was going to have really harmful long-term effects. Nobody around me agreed with me. And they were even angry. It wasn't like, oh, let's have a polite discussion about it. They were really angry with me for even bringing it up and saying, I don't think this is the right thing to do. I refused to wear a mask from the beginning, and my friends just wouldn't hang out with me. I was like, this is obviously bullshit. Excuse my language. You can edit it. One day they're saying masks don't work, and the next day they're like, oh, no, put this piece of cloth over your face and it's going to save you and everybody else. Like, it was obvious to me that this was just political posturing. And it just sort of stunned me that everybody went along with it without asking any questions. And in fact, getting angry about people who asked questions.
Well, and I remember reading, because you became somewhat well known at the time for a Twitter account you made called Lefty Lockdown Skeptic. And I remember reading a couple of articles you wrote about your opposition to COVID restrictions was actually grounded in how it might hurt some of the same people you're probably defending as a public defender, poorer people. Can you talk a little bit about that? And did that argument resonate any with any of your colleagues or contemporaries?
Not at the time. A few people have now admitted that they got it wrong, who gave me a hard time then. But that was sort of the framework through which I looked at it. I also had issues with the civil liberties violations.
Totally, yeah.
Now, if the restrictions worked and wouldn't have these harmful effects, then of course it's a different cost-benefit analysis, right? I mean, I'm going to look at things differently. But realizing that they were going to have these horrendous collateral effects, this required restricting people's civil liberties in a way that I didn't think government should be able to do, absent some sort of really insurmountable evidence that this was necessary to, protect the lives of most people, or a lot of. I mean, we don't have to get into that, but it was very clear to me that this wasn't going to do any of it. Could potentially make things worse, actually, by people being sort of in houses together. And I mean, I worked with a lot of poor people in New York. There are families that would shock a lot of people who are more affluent, but there are families who live 10 people to a one-bedroom apartment, and I was picturing those kids, like, they don't get a laptop per child and a quiet space to study. And like, are you kidding? Like, this is, and then, dad still has to go to work delivering food, and mom has to go to the hospital as a nurse and come back, and then they're all more together, and the grandparents are there. Like, this doesn't make any sense at all. So yes, I mean, that was sort of the most obvious thing to me, and I thought it would be a way to reach people on the left, even though I had what might be considered like libertarian concerns about the civil liberties aspect. But they weren't receptive at all. No, I was totally dismissed and told that, like, the experts say otherwise, and why would you're a public defender, you have a law degree, why would you think better than the experts? And that was a question I asked myself a lot. Like, am I wrong? Am I crazy? And it took me months to meet a single person who had any of the sort of doubts that I had on the question. So it was very isolating. That was when I went online. I was not on social media at the time. I went online and I found like Jeffrey Tucker and Alex Berenson, and I was like, okay, there are like two people who seem to agree with this.
Were you able to like patch things up with any of those friends, or are those relationships just kind of no longer a part of your life?
Most of the people, I'm not friends with almost all of them. There were one or two people who stuck with me, one of whom didn't like what I was doing, but still thought I was a good person and wanted to stay friends, and has admitted now that I got it right. And then another who actually quietly sort of said, I think you have a lot of this right, but I'm too afraid to say it. But so two people, and I had a lot, like I was a very social person, and I was young and childless, well, youngish, I guess. I had a lot of friends, and so there are 25 people I don't talk to probably anymore.
Well, so let's get into the more recent news. A few weeks ago, Jimmy Kimmel said on his show that MAGA was, quote, desperately trying to characterize this kid, talking about the person who assassinated Charlie Kirk, as anything other than one of them. And then Kimmel went on to say that MAGA has been trying to score political points from the assassination. So then Brendan Carr, the chair of the FCC, said that if ABC didn't, quote, take action against Kimmel for that comment, then Carr would, quote, do this the hard way, the easy way or the hard way. What do you think he meant?
Well, he clearly meant that there were going to be some kind of repercussions on ABC if they didn't get Kimmel off the air. So that's the jawboning. It's basically the same thing that we argued about in the Missouri versus Biden, Murthy versus Missouri in the Supreme Court. I mean, it's effectively the same argument that the government is using its clout to silence views it doesn't like.
That was totally taking the thoughts straight out of my head. Right after that happened, you saw a lot of people comparing it to that case. You saw the people who were not sympathetic to Carr saying it's exactly like Murthy versus Missouri. And then you had the people who thought Carr was right, saying, actually, they're totally different. So it sounds like you do not think, as you were one of the lead attorneys on that case, you do not think it was totally different.
No.
Can you talk about why it is not totally different?
I mean, I don't even understand what the argument would be for why it would be. If anything, Kimmel has a stronger case. I mean, I think my clients should have won. I don't know how much you want me to get into the weeds with the legal stuff.
You all lost before the Supreme Court
on standing, which contrary to a lot of what the media said. The court did not say what the government did was fine. Basically, what they said was, in order to bring a case, you have to have what's called standing. You have to show that you've been harmed by the person that you're suing. So you have to show an injury, and then it's traceable to the party that you're suing, and that you can get it fixed by the party, by an injunction or whatever. And the court said the social media companies basically had policies in place moderating content before this. Your clients sometime thereafter were censored, but you can't prove that it was the government's interference. So yes, the government interfered, but you can't show that interference was what led to them being censored. So maybe somebody could bring this suit, but your clients aren't the one, or they don't have enough evidence up front. I think it's a terrible position to take because it sort of puts people in a catch-22. Like, you have to get to discovery in order to be able to show that. Like, the government's not going to say, we told Twitter to take Jay Bhattacharya off social media, and then they did. Like, that's never going to happen. Actually, Alex Berenson does have that case, but he's one of the few people in the country to have such a good case. And so it just closes the courthouse door to a lot of people, and it allows the government to get away with a lot. So I think this was really bad precedent. Kimmel doesn't have that issue because he was singled out specifically, and he's been on air for 20 years, and within hours he was taken off it after these statements. So I think he has an extremely strong case. Now, some people have said because ABC let him back on.
That's exactly.
Sorry.
No, it's perfect. So I have seen that. I've seen people say, well, because he was let back on, it actually means that the FCC didn't do anything and those people don't have an argument. Can you respond to that?
Yeah. So the whole point is that the government shouldn't be involved in these decisions. Now, the initial decision, what happened was ABC did some calculation. Kimmel gets these ratings. The government has this power, crunch some numbers. What should we do? Okay, get him off the air. Then there was a public outcry, and that led ABC to do a new calculation based on the public outcry. A lot of
celebrities saying, I'm not going to do these events and that kind of thing.
Okay, then they came up with a different result. But the government shouldn't be involved in that at all. Right. They shouldn't have their thumb on the scale of censorship. And so just because there was another backlash that led to a change doesn't make the government's conduct acceptable.
Something I also saw a lot after Kimmelgate. People were floating around an FCC rule that says if you say something false on public airwaves and it causes great public harm, that the FCC chair is permitted to get involved. And I actually saw that circulating from a lot of really smart people. What is your response to that? Is that the kind of thing that this was intended for?
No. Well, first of all, if such a law is clearly First Amendment violative, like, the FCC is a government entity, and the First Amendment prohibits the government from abridging the freedom of speech. The Supreme Court has been clear that so-called lies are protected by the First Amendment. There was a case called Alvarez. There have been many others where they said that. The reason for that is that, again, we don't want government to be the arbiter of the truth. What's a lie one day can turn out to be the truth another day. It was true in the summer of 2021 that the COVID vaccine prevented you from contracting COVID.
Right. And that's what we were told by everyone.
Yeah. And it was a lie that you could still get it and transmit it. Now, everyone agrees that it's actually the opposite. So the whole point is that we reach the truth through discussion and debate, not through censorship. So to say there is some truth and we're going to put the government in charge of silencing views that aren't the truth is completely insane. If there is such a law, that violates the Constitution. Congress can't enact such a law, and someone should challenge it.
Right. One of the things that was interesting that came up during arguments during the suit against the Biden administration was there seemed to be debate among the justices about coercion versus essentially persuasion. Ketanji Brown Jackson had a viral quote that I would argue was taken out of context where she said, the argument is hamstringing the government in significant ways. Obviously, the point of the First Amendment is to hamstring the government in significant ways, but I think what she was getting at is similar to what Justice Brett Kavanaugh was talking about, where, when he was a press secretary, he would call people up and be like, that's not what I said, I want better coverage, that kind of thing. So is there a way to draw a line in the sand between persuasion and coercion? Do you have kind of like a vision in mind for what the delineation would be?
So I would argue that that's actually not the correct question, that the government also shouldn't be in the business of persuading private industry to censor speech. I think that's probably a harder sell with the current Supreme Court. We have the Fifth Circuit in our case found in our favor, actually. And it was the government who appealed. That's why the name switched.
Right. Because it was Missouri v. Biden.
Yeah. And then because the government was appealing, it was the government first. But Biden got kicked out because you can't actually get an injunction against the president. So Murthy, who is the Surgeon General, was the next defendant. And so the case became Murthy versus Missouri. But so the Fifth Circuit, we were trying to hammer out the standard in the Fifth Circuit, which had reached the merits. What is the line? Of course, the government's allowed to say its own view. The government is absolutely entitled to put out tweets saying we think everyone should get the COVID vaccine, and it's a really bad idea not to. But I think the line is when the government is telling private industry, social media companies, or other kinds of companies, take this speech down, or even just saying we think you should take this speech down, or this kind of speech should be censored. The government should adhere to the principle that debate and dialogue are the principles underlying the First Amendment, that's how we reach the best ideas, not censorship. Now, I do think it's going to be a harder sell for courts. I think that there's been kind of an understanding recently that it's coercion that's required, and the government is allowed to have some kind of involvement or try to persuade the companies to do that. I think that's wrong.
It also just seems like an impossible line to draw. Like, when would it be? Like, when would persuasion become? There's no magic wand where you just know that's the answer. But it's interesting because the decision was 6-3, so it was a mix of the three liberals and three conservatives. What did you think of the merits of the dissent?
Well, I thought the dissent was quite good. It's not exactly what I would have written because they actually did kind of adopt the coercion standard. They implied that that was the level. So I think if I were to write the decision, I would say the government is violating the First Amendment when it is injecting itself into content moderation decisions and advocating for censoring speech, regardless of whether that advocating is more like coercion or it's more like pressure or it's more like encouragement or even cooperation. I mean, the CDC's involvement was interesting because they were sort of at the beginning, even under Trump. I don't think Trump knew about it, so it's a little different, but they were sort of the companies were contacting the CDC and saying, like, can you tell us what's COVID misinformation? What should we be taking down? Now, I think a lot of courts would not agree with me, would just have a lot of trouble saying the government has to say, can't be involved in this. I actually think it's the government's responsibility to say, we're the government. It's not, we're happy to put out our own information and tell people what we think, but we don't think that you should take down speech. Certainly not based on what we say. That would be really good behavior that I know is obviously very high expectations considering the level of politicians that we're dealing with these days. But, I think in an ideal world, that is what would happen.
You mentioned Alex Berenson, who, if people don't know, is kind of a controversy. He was very controversial on COVID. He's very anti-marijuana. I think a former reporter at the New York Times, right? Who kind of went off and did a lot of kind of his own independent punditry that has polarized a lot of people. And he's often labeled a conspiracy theorist. How do you respond to people who say, well, his speech is objectively bad, it's objectively wrong, so the government was doing something that was good for society? I'm sure you encounter that argument. How do you respond to that?
What's objectively or bad or so, I can't, those aren't even concepts I can really even work with because everybody has just, different opinions. And I'm sure everyone's heard of Galileo. He's sort of the prime example where all the scientists were against him and he turned out to be right. So again, even if we could decide somehow, I don't know if you could democratically decide what's a bad idea and what's a good idea. Sure, we could take votes there, but that's the point, is that minority opinions are protected because they sometimes turn out to be correct.
Totally. Civil rights weren't popular.
Exactly. And it's just the whole concept of the First Amendment is that debate, dialogue, open discussion are the best way to deal with all ideas, good, bad, whatever. Censorship is not only is it not a good idea from a practical standpoint because it puts someone in charge of deciding what's true or what's false. That's obviously going to be human. I guess you could make it AI, but that would have tons of its own problems. That might be what I'm doing 10 years from now. But also the idea that censorship just makes ideas go away is simply untrue. What actually happens is it tends to drive them underground. And
the Streisand effect.
Yeah,
Can
exactly.
you talk about the Streisand effect? People who don't know what that is?
Yeah, I actually don't know exactly what happened, but I was reading about it today and I already forgot. But
so it's Barbra Streisand, the famous singer, Broadway queen, who I suppose some activists were talking about her house, and I put up a picture of her Malibu mansion, and she was so incensed that a picture of her Malibu mansion was on that she made a big stink about it. It was like tried to censor the photo of the mansion, and it went from getting like 300 views to like hundreds of thousands. I think the website may have even, don't quote me on that. But anyways, it's been named after her, much to her dismay, I think, to the phenomenon exactly what you just described, where she just really didn't want people to see this. Very few people had seen it. And now the world knows about her Malibu mansion.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it actually happened to me. Like I had some tweets censored during the sort of height of the vaccine hysteria where I said I wasn't getting the vaccine or something. And they were censored. And I posted screenshots of how they were censored. And then those tweets went completely viral, like way more than the original tweet. So because people are like, oh my God, this is being censored. This is crazy. And people who got kicked off of Twitter, and there were a lot for some time. Alex Berenson was one, actually just totally lost their accounts, which can be quite problematic. It's Berenson made money off his, a lot of money. Right. It's very important for his, work. So for some people, this isn't just like a hobby. It actually is completely connected to their ability to make an income. But, a lot of people who got kicked off Twitter went to Gab and Getter and whatever, where they were much more likely to encounter echo chambers and less pushback on, what you and I might think are problematic views, like the vaccine has a microchip and stuff. So just the idea that by censoring people, the idea goes away is just not true.
Totally. So there's not only a moral issue, but a practical issue.
Exactly.
Speaking of creators who make their living online, you mentioned that there was some news today as we're talking. So basically the Council for Alphabet, which includes Google and YouTube, sent a letter to your former boss, Republican Jim Jordan. And I noticed this line. Essentially, they were talking about different censorship efforts that the Biden administration had made. And they said, it is unacceptable and wrong when any government, including the Biden administration, attempts to dictate how the company moderates content. And the company has consistently fought against those efforts on First Amendment grounds, which seems not very vague now that people are willing to say, okay, they did this. Why do you think the tide is changing?
Because they're trying to suck up to Trump. That's what I think. Just like Zuckerberg did something kind of similar right before Trump took office and said, yeah, what we did was really bad. We were under pressure from Biden. Now it will be interesting to see they framed it all as about censorship of conservative viewpoints. I actually know somebody who was kicked off of YouTube. She had a monetized channel. She made thousands of dollars a month, and she has not a salary. It was actually kind of important to her. She was completely demonetized for a pro-Palestine video. They said was promoting Hamas propaganda, which it wasn't. I watched the video. It's very much advocating for Palestinian human rights. So she was demonetized. Now it will be interesting. I will probably do something for her now. It was a hard case without Google admitting it.
Right.
But it will be interesting if they let her back on, because now that will, I think, be very telling as to whether they're actually trying to have a renewed commitment to free speech or whether they're just trying to take advantage of the political moment and curry favor with the Trump administration. Which
has shown it as not a big fan of pro-Palestine speech. So let's talk about that. You've already established that you were not a big fan of Biden on free speech. So I'll just start broad. How do you feel about the Trump administration's approach?
Well, the Trump administration is worse. People have loved to ask me, do I think so? I think it's worse. I have asked better, worse, and I sort of hedged for a while. I wasn't sure. And one reason is that I think it was harder to hold Biden to account because so much was done in secret. And I think you saw that in the Supreme Court decision, right? Because so much of this was covert. We didn't have the evidence out there. We got some discovery, but it was very limited just in the context of an emergency motion. So Trump just puts it all out there, so I think it's actually better for lawsuits, and he's lost a lot. He's a lot of the deportation cases where he was trying to deport people for pro-Palestine speech. He's in federal court. He's lost all of them so far. They haven't gone very high yet. I imagine one or two of them will. But what I think makes it worse is that the consequences of the Trump speech suppression regime are much more severe. Biden was not, for the most part, putting people behind bars, getting them expelled from school, through pressure on universities.
Or expelled through the country.
Yeah, expelled. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I never lay awake at night during Biden's reign worried about like my dad getting deported. My dad is a citizen, but he's naturalized. And I think there's, these are like real fears I have now. Even worried about, them eventually trying to come after me. They've made, they've alluded to the fact that their next plan is to try to denaturalize citizens for what the, anti-Semitic or terrorist speech, which is very clearly just, conflating people who advocate for Palestinian rights with that. So I think because the consequences are so much more severe, the chilling effect is more drastic. I mean, even if you make your living off your social media account, it's still losing your social media account is not the same as being kicked out of your country away from your kids and or being put behind bars. So the chilling effect is just so much more severe that I think that has a much larger impact on quelling debate.
I want to talk about a few of those individual cases. There was, of course, Mahmoud Khalil, who of an immigration judge just ruled can be deported because the government says he lied on his green card application about his association with a certain group. Is that a fair argument?
No, and I'll tell you why. So to be clear, this is a lot of people don't understand this. Most of these people, like he Rameza Ozturk, Mahsan Madawi, they have separate cases in immigration court and federal court. So
and Mahmoud Khalil won in federal court.
He won in federal court, and he's going back to federal court to challenge the immigration judge's ruling. So they're basically saying this ruling is violative of the Constitution. One thing a lot of people don't know is that immigration judges are actually not independent. They're part of the executive. So they're part of the DOJ, which I think is pretty shocking and like a major constitutional problem that
especially when we talk about due process and things like that. I mean, like you're getting a hearing in front of the same entity that's trying to punish you or deport you or whatever.
Exactly. And that's why I think a lot of judges are just very biased in favor of the administration. So I think this will continue to be a battle between the immigration judge and the federal judge, like not directly, but it'll. So essentially, the judge found that he could be deported because of this error on the green card application after the federal judge found that the initial basis for deporting him violated his constitutional rights, that it was just basically pro-Palestine activism. That was speech. They couldn't try to twist this INA statute in order to deport him using it.
And that's the Immigration and Nationality Act.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we can get into that if you want or not. But basically, if I were the judge, I would say you clearly went after this guy because of his speech. Now you're trying to find some kind of little thing that he did wrong. You comb through the papers. And I did not look at this carefully. My understanding is that he left off an internship or something, which, given the question, was sort of reasonable. But in any event, I actually used to represent people convicted of criminal convictions who were being deported. Convicted of crimes who were being deported. And I'd work with immigration attorneys, so I take care of the sort of criminal aspect. They'd take care of the immigration aspect. And you did not. I never saw somebody with a green card, a wife and child in the country, being deported for anything other than a heinous crime, like even somewhat minor crimes, like low-level felonies. The judges would let So this is clearly an attempt to try to find something to now justify this post hoc. So if I were the federal judge, I would say no. You are, you had your chance.
Because he has not been convicted of any crime,
correct? No. So I don't know. I don't know what this how they categorize the leaving the thing off the application, but my understanding is it's clearly a pretext. I mean, that's obviously what they did. And if I were the judge, I'd say, you had your chance. You're clearly trying to come after this guy for his speech, and now you're trying to find some little thing he did wrong. No.
Right. Because he was essentially a big player in these protests at Columbia, correct?
That's my understanding. And he had explicitly denounced anti-Semitism. And he was like, he was not, there was a lot of attempt to sort of, what I saw was a lot of lumping together of conduct. Like, these protests are violent and students did X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, but did Mahmoud Khalil do X, Y, and Z? Like, guilt is individual. Mahmoud Khalil didn't overtake Hamilton Hall or vandalize anything or hit anybody we can't, this is not how we do criminal justice.
Sure. And then how do you, it's interesting because the Republican Party at one point not only said it stood for, but was almost defined by what you just described: individualism, personal responsibility, an opposition to collectivism. How do you reconcile that in these cases?
Well, I hate to say racism because I think the term is so overused, but I do think it's a lot of racism. There's just a lot of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim animus. They are very eager to get rid of anyone who's an Arab Muslim, especially someone who's outspoken about Palestinian human rights, and they don't, so anything they'll glom onto. And they've just become less and less. I mean, we also saw it with like the Charlie Kirk outcry, just people like Matt Walsh. I don't know if you saw his Twitter, just sort of declaring this war between the left and the right. This, sure. This like as though everybody on the left, we don't even know what's his name's politics are. The kid, Tony, what's his name?
Tyler
Robinson.
I think we only know that he was perhaps offended by Charlie Kirk's stance on transgender issues or gender, that sort of thing. But you're right, we don't know exactly, who he was involved with.
But certainly trying to paint this as some kind of the leftists are trying to kill us because of what this deranged 22-year-old did is crazy. Like,
one of the things that I struggled with in the response to that, which was a horrible event, obviously. But I think by doing what you're describing and saying the left wants to kill us, the Democrat Party, quote unquote, wants to kill us, for one, I didn't see a single Democratic politician. I mean, I guess Ilhan Omar may have said something tasteless according to some, but every high-profile politician I saw, Ezra Klein, he wrote his big New York Times thing about how Charlie Kirk was doing politics right. These people were uniformly condemning this as unacceptable. And I think that by blaming it on the left and using it as a pretext, you were mentioning the speech implications. There are, professors who are getting pushed out for saying, I condemn this violence, but Charlie Kirk was terrible, which is definitely a First Amendment protected view. It just foments more of the division that may have led to this moment of like us versus them. This is war is a direct quote from Libs of TikTok. If people, how do you think people can turn down the temperature if that is the approach?
Right. I don't know. And I will say, I do think the left does it too. And they did it during COVID, like these right wingers who are just not wearing their masks and spreading COVID. And, we saw a lot of that too. So I think both sides do this. And again, it's just sort of emblematic of the heightened partisanship in the country.
As you were talking, and that manifests in opposition to speech and crackdowns on speech.
Yeah.
You also mentioned Rameza Ozturk, the Tufts student, the PhD student who was arrested, and the only evidence the government has given in her case at this point, as we were talking about this, was that she had co-authored an op-ed in support of, I think, the university divesting from Israel. I read the op-ed. It was very benign. I suppose Marco Rubio or, attorneys for Marco Rubio have made the argument that her deportation is necessary essentially for national security reasons. Can you talk about that? Yes.
I mean, it's utterly absurd. So this provision that they've invoked in I think it's the same one in all of these cases, Khalil Mahdawi, Rameza Ozturk, is a very obscure provision of national security immigration law that allows the Secretary of State to unilaterally declare somebody a threat to our foreign policy, so without any judicial oversight, and deport them. The statute, I think, has only been invoked a couple of times in the last 50 years or so. And there was one case, ironically, perhaps by Trump's sister, who was a federal judge in New Jersey, where she declared that the statute was unconstitutionally vague because it wasn't clear what it prohibited. It might, if it encompassed speech, then that was unconstitutional. If it didn't encompass speech, that wasn't clear. So it's a problematic statute. The decision I got a lot of shit on Twitter because the decision was reversed by the Third Circuit, but on other grounds. So they didn't touch on her reasoning or say that her reasoning was wrong. So it kind of stands, and there just haven't been a lot of judicial decisions on it. So the justification that Rubio is using in these cases is saying we are pro-Israel and we're against anti-Semitism, and being pro-Palestine is anti-Israel. Being against the war in Gaza, or I don't call it a war anymore. Being against what Israel is doing in Gaza is anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, and therefore, if you protest or are against that, you are anti-Semitic and you are anti-Israel, and that conflicts with our foreign policy. I mean, this is like ridiculous. We've never ever seen anything like this in this country, sort of stretching a provision like this. And, a lot of people have said, well, citizens don't have First Amendment rights. It doesn't matter. Or non-citizens, sorry, immigrants don't have First Amendment rights. I don't think that's the right analysis at all. The First Amendment is a restraint on government. It prohibits the government from abridging the freedom of speech. It does not talk about the immigration status of the speaker, and I think that's by design. So to the extent that, if the statute allows people to be deported for their speech, it's unconstitutional, or it should be interpreted in such a way as to say, no, it's not about this kind of thing. It's if you're providing material support for terrorism or something like that, something much, much more grave than your views.
Does it matter that she wasn't a green card holder and was instead on a student visa? Does that change the legal background of that in terms of her speech?
Not in my view from a First Amendment perspective. I don't think it should matter. I don't think it should matter if someone's undocumented. That's just not, there might be other grounds to deport them, but that's not, it's just about the government not being able to punish somebody for their speech. Other people probably disagree. And, courts might find a difference between green card holders and visa holders. I think from a sort of practical standpoint, Mahmoud Khalil shocked everybody a lot because he was a green card holder, married to a U.S. citizen and about to have a baby. So I think that really was, yeah.
The argument that non-citizens are not entitled to constitutional rights came up a lot in terms of the people who were deported without due process to El Salvador. What did you make of that? I know that your primary area is speech, but you're very passionate about civil liberties across the board. What did you make of that? Shipping a bunch of Venezuelans off to the terrorism confinement center without so much as a hearing.
Yeah, well, anybody who cares about individual liberties should be horrified by that. All we're saying is get a hearing. You get a hearing. We're not saying you should be able to stay necessarily, but we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing in a specific case. And people were deported who shouldn't have been. Right. I don't know. I know there was a lot of confusion around that one guy, and I don't want to weigh in on that specific case because I don't know enough about it. But everybody should, of course, before they're removed from the country, get some kind of hearing.
Right. Right. And one of the things that kind of confused me is a nice word for it, but I'll go with that. Confused me about that case or that general controversy was that the Republican Party has also, many times over the years, defined itself not only by personal responsibility, but by skepticism of government and the idea that the government doesn't always get it right. That was core to why the founders liked due process, right? Because it was, essentially challenging that the government wasn't going to get every criminal accusation correct, every accusation to support something like this. And as a public defender, I'm sure you know that very well. Yeah. What do you make of that? Of that kind of, we will just implicitly accept, the government says these are bad people, despite that one of them, the evidence against him is, he had tattoos mom and dad tattoos. The makeup artist I'm referring to, whose case got a lot of attention. What do you make of I'm just going to accept the government narrative and go with it? It's
really strange for people who claim to be skeptical of government. What seems to have happened is they're like, now my guy's in office, so I'm just going to accept whatever they do. It's some kind of tribalism. I again think it goes back to this extreme partisanship that's sort of developed over the past couple of decades in this country, and so much antagonism towards the other side that you kind of really care much more about being on your team and just supporting whatever your team does than caring about people's rights and doing the right thing. So it's all part of the same phenomenon, I think, and it's really a deterioration of the fundamental guarantees of our Constitution in our country that used to make it a nice place to live.
You don't think so anymore?
I'm okay, but there are lots of people who aren't.
Right. I want to go back briefly to the question of the reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination, because I think we've seen kind of an unprecedented, I hate that word, unprecedented, because it is overused, but in some sense, a swell to push people out of public life for expressing criticism of him in a way that I don't know that I've ever really seen before in recent memory. And I want to make a distinction between people like, a nurse who goes on Instagram and posts a picture of herself and says, all white men should die. I don't know that I want that person being my nurse. But I think a lot of people don't realize that government employees, which includes, public university officials, the Supreme Court has confirmed that they have First Amendment protections in the workplace. And you see some people, Clemson fired someone, for instance, or has said it will fire a professor who was making tasteless comments after Charlie Kirk's murder, that sort of thing. People, as I said earlier, who may, condemn violence, but then go on to say, but he wasn't a great guy. He had bad views. Harmy Dillon, head of DOJ for civil rights, seems to be pretty on board with this kind of thing. What do you think of that?
Well, so it's all part of this whole thing, It's like team player, like, we hate this other side, we're going to do everything to take them down. It's really a problem. Now, it is an interesting question because while public employees do have First Amendment rights, there are some limitations. So if you say things on social media, for instance, or whatever, at a work event or an outside event that conflict with your ability to do your job or your I don't know. Like, one example I give is, say that a kindergarten teacher posts on social media that I think Asian kids are smarter than black and white kids. I mean, right. You don't really want that person teaching your kid. I think a lot of courts would say, okay, the framework is sort of like that detracts from your ability to do your job. You can't have the trust of the community, the kids, the parents, whatever. So that's like an obvious case where somebody's speech really they just can't do the job. But I think what happens in these sorts of situations is people want to sort of expand the boundaries past the point of recognition. So now it's like, right. Well, someone said something about Charlie Kirk that offended me, so they shouldn't be able to work in the post office anymore. It was actually the same thing, by the way, during COVID and also what's happening with the deportations and the pro-Palestine speech, where people say, oh, these are threats, or, saying people shouldn't get the vaccine could cause imminent harm because then people might not get the vaccine. This is like the Supreme Court has carved out these very, very narrow exceptions right. that are supposed to be interpreted as narrowly as possible, like incitement to violence, where if you're talking to a crowd and you say, go kill that guy over there, he raped my daughter or something, and that, that might be incitement to violence. But just sort of generally giving people ideas that might cause them to do things that are harmful, that's all free speech. That's part of the idea that people have to be exposed to ideas and we can't have government decide, we're not living in a nanny state where it's like, this idea is dangerous. You can't hear it. You can't even hear that maybe you shouldn't get the vaccine because then you might not get the vaccine. Like, this is crazy. And the same thing, like, oh, you can't even hear that somebody didn't like Charlie Kirk because, I don't even know what the justification is. But it's again, this like cancel culture is really, really problematic.
Do you think things are getting worse or better?
Worse. Yeah.
In terms of, so I guess I want to make a distinction. What do you think about where we are in terms of a culture of free speech? I see the Charlie Kirk stuff, the reaction to the Charlie Kirk stuff, and it makes me nervous. You also have, letters like this from the Alphabet CEO where they're kind of owning up to, like you said, maybe they're just searching for better treatment from the government. But are there some silver linings, I guess? Are there some things that are getting better in terms of mob mentality? Are there some areas that have improved? I'm trying to find the...
I don't see it. I would love to, because I have a young son and I would like him to live in a better world. I don't see a lot of hope. To me, it just keeps getting more and more sort of entrenched. The justifications I see to suppress speech and to sort of punish your political opponents or ideological opponents are just more extreme, more harsh. If you go by Twitter, maybe I shouldn't go by Twitter, but if you go by Twitter, it just looks nastier and nastier, more aggressive and more willing to sort of ruin people's lives because they said something that you didn't like or your political party doesn't like. So, I don't and a lot of my liberal relatives who didn't like my views during the COVID era, to say the least, have now been like calling me up like, oh, it's like you're bad. You get it now. And you see how bad Trump is. And I'm like, no, you are totally missing the point. That is not like, that is not what my views are. My views are like, both of these parties are awful, and Americans need to fight to retake our civil liberties again. I'm not now on your side.
Right. Do you still feel like you have a side?
No, my side is just no. I'm completely politically homeless. I don't feel like I will work with anybody on, if we have common cause on the issues I think are important. And then when that alliance no longer makes sense because they're on the other side or not, we go our separate ways and I find new allies.
What do you think the left and the right get most wrong about the First Amendment when you're doing this work and you see, various claims about what it does or doesn't do? Are they the same? Are they different?
They're very similar. So I actually alluded to it earlier. It's sort of this idea that because speech could indirectly cause harm if someone were to act on it, that therefore it's not protected. And that seems to be a concept that people are willing to stretch very, very far in order to silence ideas they don't like. And they both do it.
What was your reaction to Pam Bondi's appearances on when she went on Katie Miller, her podcast, and said, hate speech is not free speech. And then she went on Fox News and said, she could prosecute people for not printing a Charlie Kirk poster. What is your reaction to stuff like that?
So I was speechless. I mean, it's funny because the right is the one who's fought against this idea of hate speech. For years. Yeah. I have to write so many emails to, my boomer liberal relatives, like explaining why we don't have hate speech laws. I can't tell you how many times I've had to, I do some copying and pasting at various points. They just don't get it. Like, no, of course people shouldn't be able to say, whatever. I don't even want to say some of these things, but like, of course people shouldn't be able to say that. I'm like, no, you can't have the government policing this stuff. But what was very interesting was that most prominent conservatives came out immediately and denounced what she was saying.
Right.
And I don't think it was so much out of principle. I think it was embarrassing because she used the exact term. They've been going for this, we're not doing cancel culture. We're doing accountability culture. They just wanted her to use a different term so it wasn't as blatant how hypocritical it was.
Right. And a direct quote on the podcast where she said, and this is across the aisle, it was as if she was saying, well, I know people on the left also hate speech, so now we are policing that. I mean, the top law enforcement official in the country.
Yeah.
And do you think she knows the law?
No. I don't think so. She must not. And I actually said, ironically, she actually might be someone who should be removed from her job for her speech because it has shown that she can't do the job. Like, if you don't understand this basic concept that we do not have hate speech laws in this country. And by the way, I mean, I have an excellent example of why we shouldn't have hate speech, why it's proper that we don't. There's a writer named C.J. Hopkins. I don't know if you know him. He lives in Germany. He's a really great guy. Germany has hate speech laws, and he wrote a book during the COVID era called something like The New Totalitarianism or something. And on the cover was a picture of a swastika covered by a mask. Of course, the point being that COVID mandates were kind of like Nazism or something. Now, I do not. I think that's hyperbolic. I think a lot of people might find that offensive, and you are allowed, in a free society, you should be allowed to be offensive and hyperbolic and all those things. He is actually being prosecuted under Germany's hate speech laws. And funny enough, the law prohibits using the swastika for purposes of promoting Nazi ideology, which he clearly wasn't doing. Right. But they have decided to stretch this definition to make an example of him. And he was actually acquitted at the first trial. But in some parts of Europe, including Germany, you can, in the U.S., obviously, that would violate double jeopardy rules. But in Germany, the prosecutor can appeal the acquittal. And so he appealed and won. So the CJ is now going to the highest court in Germany and theoretically faces jail time. He thinks it's unlikely that will happen, but I mean, that's just crazy.
It is crazy.
This is why we do not want the government involved in this stuff.
Right. And then does it make your head explode that we have like Vice President J.D. Vance going and making speeches about, problematic hate speech laws in the UK and Germany while the Trump administration tries to deport someone for an op-ed?
Yes, it's insane. Actually, there's a bit of Rubio. I forgot who he was talking to very recently, and he was talking about how we need to make sure that our Americans who are abroad are protected when it comes to free speech. And he literally said this, I kid you not. I mean, I don't know a word for word, but he said this. We want to make sure that, say, our students who are studying in a foreign country, maybe they write an op-ed that offends the government. We don't want the government to be able to deport them for writing op-ed. I was like, are you joking? Are you like sitting there like trying to hide a smile, seeing if anyone's going to catch you on this? Or are you that oblivious? Like he had just arrested Rameza Ozturk. I mean,
which
and
is crazy, right?
Yeah.
And she spent, 6 weeks in a detention facility
yes,
for that?
And she had really bad asthma and was not given the medical care that she needed. I mean, it was really bad. This was a 5'2" human rights where she was studying to be a social worker, like extremely concerned about human rights, just sweet woman on her way to an end of Ramadan ceremony with some friends, and they whisked her off the street and put her behind bars and shipped her to Louisiana. I mean, this is like just crazy despotic stuff.
Have you met or spoke with her?
No, I haven't.
Do you think that she stands a chance of winning and fighting her deportation?
So I do not know the answer to that question. I don't know that much about immigration law, and it's confusing how it interacts with the First Amendment law. So she did get a favorable preliminary ruling on the First Amendment issue. I don't know if exactly what's going on with her immigration case and how that will play out.
Right, and I think there is wide latitude for the Secretary of State to just kind of say, I don't want you to have a student visa anymore. But I would think it is hard to defend the idea that the administration supports a culture of free speech, even if it comports with the law, canceling her student visa while doing that. I mean, wouldn't you say that's...
Right. And then, there's plenty of laws that say the government can't condition a benefit on... So, yes, we can all accept that a student visa is a benefit, right? You're not entitled to one. But there are many laws saying that the government cannot condition benefits on restricting your speech. There was a famous case called Spicer versus Randell where veterans, in order to get their veterans benefits, were required to take a loyalty oath. And some of them didn't want to. It was like compelled speech. And the court said, no, you can't you can't predicate a benefit on requiring people to give up their First Amendment rights. So, and there was another case, Perry something. I actually forgot the name of the other, whatever. It was a professor who had criticized the administration, and they terminated his contract for criticizing the university administration. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. He has free speech rights, and sure, he's not entitled to employment, but you can't take his employment away because of what he said.
So you recently started a new position. Tell me a little bit about what you're working on these days.
So I started as National Legal Director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and their aim in bringing me in is to have a much more robust First Amendment practice. Given what's going on these days, I think a lot of people see the threat to the Arab American community in the free speech arena as pretty significant. So I currently have one case. I just started a couple of weeks ago. We have some other cases percolating, but I just brought one in. Actually, the client is a defendant, and she had an encounter with a pro-Israel woman it was a dueling protests, pro-Palestine, pro-Israel protests in front of Dirksen's Senate building. And my client allegedly grabbed the woman's Israeli flag cape and briefly, she said it choked her. This actually, I don't think this happened. And my client was actually acquitted at a criminal trial where the judge found that the victim and her police officer witness were not credible. And my client was credible. However, the alleged victim decided to sue in civil court and got a favorable judge who granted a preliminary injunction in her favor and had a lot of problematic language. There's a lot of problems with his interpretation of the statute she sued under. And then he also conflated the Israeli flag with sort of Jewish identity. So he said that pulling on the Israeli flag was an act of anti-Semitic discrimination, permitting the penalties that she's looking for. So I don't think that my client actually pulled the flag, but even if she did, I think there's a serious problem with equating those two things. You know, this is one of the points we make in the brief is she didn't walk up to someone wearing a Jewish Star of David on the street and grab it. You know, this was clearly in context about the government of Israel's actions and sort of anti-Israel action. So we'll see how that goes.
I know you've also said you're planning on suing the Trump administration at some point. Do you know what that will look like, or?
No, and I can't. I never talk about litigation before I filed it. I can say, generally speaking, I mean, the ideas keep popping up. This issue with the universities, and a lot of people are being laid off, and Middle Eastern studies programs are getting shut down and stuff like that because the universities are afraid to let them go on. So, my decision in Murthy, or the decision we got in Murthy, unfortunately, throws a wrench in making these arguments because they make it much harder for somebody to show that the government was ultimately responsible for their injury rather than just the university making the decision on its own, which I had written an op-ed about 6 months ago saying the liberals who are cheering on Murthy are going to regret it soon. Because
one of the things I find so fascinating about free speech historically is how the pendulum swings so reliably. You have people, famous free speech activists were leftist anti-war protesters at Berkeley. Then when the left became a bit more culturally ascendant and powerful, you have free speech right at the core of conservatives' platform. And now it seems like the pendulum has swung again. where free speech is something that the liberals, leftists are kind of taking that mantle. What is the solution to this game of musical chairs, and will it ever end?
I don't know. Well, I've made it clear I'm a pessimist. I think people, what I keep trying to do is impress upon people how the decisions that you celebrate today when it's a new administration can be used against you. And I think continuing to sort of push these parallels or these concepts home with people is probably one way to get them to appreciate free speech. I mean, it would be nice if they just had respect for the idea that like speech should be our natural right, and none of us should actually be in favor of having the government punish people for their speech. Unfortunately, I'm not sure everybody can be reached on those sort of principled grounds. But I mean, that's why I do what I do. If I had no hope whatsoever, I would definitely quit, because it's like not the easiest job in the world, and I'd love to spend more time with my kids and like raise some goats or something instead of being stressed out all the time. So I obviously have a little hope. That's what keeps me going. But I think it's a daily battle, and I don't think it's ever going to be won. It requires people continually fighting and standing up for it. I think there are many, if not most people, have a lot of authoritarian impulses. And so those of us who believe in liberty, I think, have sort of an obligation to keep fighting and fighting and fighting, because if we don't, then the authoritarians are going to win.
Janine Younes, thank you for talking to Reason.
Thank you so much.